As we mentioned last week, the USDA is projecting 2015 net farm income at $58.3 billion, down 36% from last year and nearly 53% lower than the record farmers set in 2013. At the recent soybean management field day near Greenwood, Nebraska Farm Business Inc.'s Tina Barrett discussed the tighter margins farmers are now facing. We talked with Tina at the event and started by looking at the same question she asked soybean growers during her presentation. Are you a high-cost or a low-cost producer?
You know, I spent a lot of time talking about average cost, but there is no average producer. It just means that there's half on one side and half on the other. And so when we look a little deeper into some of our numbers, you know, when I add in family living and taxes and all costs that it would take to cover, and using a long-term yield and last year's cost, we're looking at like $16.50 a bushel as we need for soybeans. And certainly that's way out of the realm of what the markets are paying right now. But if I look at the producers that have the highest net return, and that group of a third, they bring that down quite a bit to about $12.80. But if a third of the group's at $12.80 and the average is $16, that means there's a whole bunch out there that are $18 to $20 a bushel. And that's pretty scary, you know, to be that far out. And so I think it's really important as producers look at that to know where they fall on that scale.
What separates those above the average and those below the average?
You know, there's certainly something in there that, I mean, cash rent's one of those. And I think for those who have held on to low or reasonable cash rents versus those that are paying really high cash rents is going to be a big divider. But there's also about $20 an acre difference in fertilizer, $5 an acre in chemicals, and another about $45 in machinery cost. And so it's not just cash rent alone, but there's certainly a lot of things that they're doing a little bit cheaper. How
do you think people should think about using inputs to boost yields if you're not going to get enough back? I mean, that conversation itself, how should we have it?
You know, it's a tough thing, and it's hard. As a producer, it's fun to grow as much as possible. But we have to think about things as to what we're putting into the crop, making sure that we're going to get a return out of it. You know, and so I use a real simple example of putting $50 an acre of fertilizer on to get 5 bushels. And if you're not getting $10 a bushel for your beans, it doesn't make sense to spend it. We don't want to spend 50 and only get 40 back out of it. And there's certainly things to keep in mind as far as the risk goes, as far as carrying that fertilizer on your operating note, or not being guaranteed that you're going to get that bushel. I mean, it could be a hailstorm or anything else, or just no rain in August, and that we're not guaranteed those bushels when we apply that extra fertilizer. So there's lots of things to keep in mind there, but it's really important when the margin gets tight to be thinking about maximizing their bottom line rather than maximizing yield.
That top third, are they paying significantly less for the land?
It's been about $80 a bushel, or $80 an acre, that they're averaging less. So it is a significant difference. And like I said, that might just be why we see that a real dividing line there.
What are you working on with producers after the season to think about next year and starting to get costs in line and determining their cost of production?
You know, it's tough. Figuring cost production's got to be your first step, so that you know what you're dealing with. Because if you're in that $18 to $20 range, we certainly don't want it to be a surprise that you're that far out of the money, because it won't be long before lenders are getting nervous, and maybe even to the point where they're not giving you the opportunity for funding the next year and you might not be farming. So we want to make sure that we make those changes and adjustments that are needed as soon as possible. On the other side of that, you know, if you're already in that $10 to $12 bushel cost production, there's certainly producers out there doing it. It's not a time to panic. And certainly, you know, you can keep going and doing what you're doing. And it might mean that we have losses for a couple of years, but hopefully you've retained a lot of the profits from the last 10 and you can withstand that as we move through this adjustment time and get back into, you know, maybe at least where we can reach some positive numbers.
You look at that cost of production per bushel, and I'm wondering if there are people who think, yeah, it might cost me more to produce it, but I'm a better marketer than the person who's doing it the other way.
Right, you know, and every producer has their own special, you know, skills that they're better at too. And so, you know, if you can guarantee that, great. I don't know that anybody's got the perfect marketing answer, or they could be an advisor to have that locked down too. But any function of net return is always a function of producing times your marketing price minus cost. And so we certainly want to look at all three of those, but you can be out of whack on one and it can ruin being really good at the others.